Oh, hey there. What am I doing before the tutorial starts? Why am I here? I just wanted to say that in the recording I did, which is a great recording, it's a great tutorial, for the first 2 minutes, I was extremely fucking angry because I tried to record it 20 times, it just didn't work, so my voice started getting louder and louder and louder. Point being, for the first maybe 1 to 2 minutes of the recording, the audio clips quite a bit. I just want you to know it gets better. I sizzle out, I get that energy out, but I don't want you being like, oh, the audio is going to be trash for this whole... It's not. It's just the first 2 minutes are, and I'm not re-recording a 30-minute tutorial that I did very well on. Either way, warning, it's loud for the first minute or two. Are you going to be a wuss about it? Are you going to click out? Are you going to be a wuss about it? I didn't think so. Enjoy the tutorial. See ya. Okay, it's time for another tutorial. I've been doing too many geometry node ones. I'm like, fuck it, shader nodes, time to go back to my roots. So this one is inspired by this node network image I found on the Blender subreddit. And when you look at it, you're thinking, wow, Leaning Tower of Pisa of nodes. This person must be sophisticated. They know something we don't. Despite all these nodes, it basically makes this kind of grid effect that I already showed you. And this is a case, and like many networks that I see on the subreddit, your node networks don't need to be this huge to make something simple. So in this case, I want to talk about this kind of scaling grid thing. This is the third fucking time I'm talking about it. I'm going to show you how to make it. The reason people make it, by the way, is it's useful for these scaling animations where you put the size of your dick compared to like a planet. You're like, yes, my penis is larger. You usually have this grid under it. And I thought, okay, it's a nice procedural result. Here's what we have. And, we can make it with quite a few less nodes. And it's not like there's literally 5 nodes here. Yes, this is a node group and there's more nodes within. But this is a much more sensical network. And it doesn't look as fucking monstrous as the other one. No, you're not going to get as many girls' phone numbers showing this one as to the other one. But this is the faster way of doing it. And additionally, the way that I made it, it has a lot of control. So here you can see the thing, we can change the colors, whatever, but we also have animation speed. So like how dense does this grid get before it transitions back to this original one? So it could be like really crazy. I mean, you wouldn't want it to be like that, but if you're scaling like really fast, you'd want something like that. Let me just go back to the original setting. We also have just the speed that this animation goes at, just kind of how quickly this thing contracts like that. So that's another way to show that. What else do we got? We also got transition speed. So if you want the transition to be kind of like a very slow fade, you have that. Or if you want it to be a fast fade, this is boring, right? This isn't engaging tutorial content. Whatever. The final one we have is the fade. And this is kind of like, it's the fade, right? It's kind of like you go to the barber and you're like, trim the sides. By the way, I'm not really a fan of fades. I know that's like the thing now. Every man gets a haircut with the sides off. I think it makes you look like a douchebag and like you're like a military wannabe. Long hair gang for life. Anyways, now that I've rambled for 3 minutes, you know what we're making? We're making a grid. We're gonna show up that guy on Reddit. We don't want him to like feel like too bad about his attempt, but yeah, it was fucking bad. So let's do better. Okay, so Blender version 3.0 alpha grid. Let's make it. So long story short, it's just going to be a material on a plane. We've done these kinds of tutorials before. Sat on a plane, go to shading, and we're going to be doing all of this in Eevee. Why? Because it's better for something like this, especially since we can enable bloom and all this. So order of business. First of all, we need to make a grid. Second of all, we need to make it get bigger and smaller. And third of all, we need to do the transition where if it gets too small, it, transitions back to the original one, okay? Lots of orders of business. Let's start with the grid. So I'm going to call this thing, what do I call it? I call it sub D, whatever. So let's start by making a grid. There's a lot of ways to do it. The guy who made the Leaning Tower of Nodes, he used a brick texture to make a thing. And you're thinking, oh, how do you make a grid out of a brick texture? Well, you make all the bricks white, the thing's black, you turn down the frequency, you make this a thing. This is a way to make a grid. I don't quite like it. So let's abandon anything this person would have done. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a wave texture. Weird, right? It's just lines. But if I take 2 of these and make one of them horizontal and one of them vertical, so X and Y, you can kind of see it's like we have like two fingers, like we have one hand going this way with the fingers and one hand going like this. And when you interlace them, of course, we're going to get a grid. So I'm going to interlace them using the math node. Okay, let's see what that looks like. So you can kind of see it's a grid. It turns out you set this to maximum, and it's going to give us the bigger of the two. But the nice thing about this is it gives us this linear gradient. And the nice thing about that is you use a greater than node, and boom, you have a grid. Don't think about it too much. Just put down the nodes and comply, you bitch. Okay, so we have a grid. We can control the thickness of it, and in some sense, we can also control the density or size of it. But this leads into an issue that we're going to need to fix, and we need to fix a lot of issues. So with this scale, you're going to see, okay, it's scaling. It's making the grid. Is this bigger or smaller? I mean, there's more squares, so it's almost like it's smaller, but it's bigger because you're zooming more out. Either way, you can see it's scaling to the corner, almost like this is held constant and it's pinching there. This is because of the texture coordinate. So that's one problem we need to solve. But either way, we have a grid. To solve this problem, we are going to scale not from generated coordinates, which is what this is using now. So you have to imagine these are both using generated coordinates by default. Instead, we're going to use object coordinates. The nice thing about object coordinates is they're centered in the middle instead of generated coordinates. Duh. What this means, of course, is now when we scale it, it's going to look like it's scaling from the middle, which for the effect we're going for, it is what we are going for, long story short. Okay. So with this whole network, really we only have a single parameter that we care about, and that's this value node, which is the scale. By the way, because this is a wave texture, we're not going to do this, but you could distort this and get a distorted grid. Which is something you can't do with the other, and you can scale it like this. Either way, that's just a thing you could do. So I'm going to take all this. I'm going to hit Control-G-Y to make it its own group. And that means we now have a grid group, so let's call it that. It's a grid. With a single parameter being this scale thing. So we basically made the network for a grid that we can scale up and down, which is 1/3 of the battle. It's not going to win us the war. It's not even going to win us anything, really, but it is a grid. So let's save this. I'm going to call this grid, but available on Patreon. Very important. You can download the final network on Patreon. Either way, we have a grid, and we made it in a very sensical way. What we want to do now is animate this thing getting, more zoomed out. Whether that is bigger or smaller, right to your pastor, but I don't know. We need to animate this thing. So what I'm thinking is if we just kind of keyframe this going up and down, that should do it. Instead of keyframes, in fact, let's use a driver. So I'm going to outsource this to a node, and I'm going to type in hash frame divided by 30. I'm so tired of explaining what this does, but here we are. What hash frame divided by 30 does. Hash frame gives us the frame number, and divided by 30 makes it 30 times slower. So you can see over time, this thing animates. For those of you with eyeballs who are paying attention, you're going to notice this thing kind of feels like it's zooming out, and as it's doing that, it's slowing down. Weird, right? I feel like this is increasing at a constant linear rate, yet somehow this zooming is slowing down. Well, it turns out that zooming, unlike a lot of other things like normal motion, it's actually exponential. What does that mean? That means that if we use a linear kind of animation style right here, so this is going up the same amount every frame, it's actually going to slow down the zooming. We actually need it to speed up to keep up with the zooming, which almost makes sense because the more you're zoomed out, the more progress you got to make. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a mathematical fact. What this means is we actually need to filter this through like exponential of some kind, whether that's an exponent or a power node. I'm going to use a power node just because this is going to give us more control. And the way you want to think about this is we have the number 2 to the power of this linearly increasing exponent. You're going to notice now it's actually increasing at a constant rate. I mean, it's exponential, but visually, we're zooming out at a constant rate. The nice thing about this is we can actually change this number, and it's going to change kind of the speed. It's still going to be constant, but it's going to be doing it faster. And in fact, because it kind of starts off quite zoomed out, I'm just going to scale this. It doesn't matter too much, but I'm just going to scale it by the same number. So if we power of 2, we divide it by 2. But you could put any number here. So you can see constant speed. Okay. Well, we have a zooming out grid, but we want this thing to not only transition, but it can't get like so small that, you can't see anything. It needs to kind of loop. Well, how do we do this and kind of repeat it? Do we make a tower of nodes like that guy did? No, that's crazy. What we're going to do instead, I'm sorry, I know I'm trashing this dude. It was a cool concept, and I'm sure he did it for a reason instead of doing it the way I'm doing it, okay? Don't hate on him. I mean, I'm the only one hating on him. Either way, or her. What we're going to do is we are going to send this through a modulo node. Why? Where is it? Actually, first of all, we're going to send it through a modulo node. Why? Because modulo is one way of many to actually repeat something. So let's see what this looks like. So it's zooming out, and then repeat. And then repeat. What's happening here is every time this number, this hash frame divided by 30 goes above 2, it's going to round back down. So it's increasing 1, 2, and then round back down. If we want it to go for longer, you can make this number 4, and then it's going to zoom way out before it skips back, as you can see here. But I'm just going to use 2. So this is one kind of like a clock. Goes back around after it goes to 12. So that's mod 12. This is mod 2. So now we have this thing that we can control. Okay, and it's repeating. But this isn't enough because we don't want it to just kind of flicker in and out of being. We want it to be the smooth transition, which is actually the hard part. To do this, we kind of almost want a second grid that's scaling at a different kind of rate. So while this one is like super small, we want the other one to just be beginning, and then we can transition between them, right? So if we have these two concurrent grids, it would be a good life. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate all this. We're going to make a second grid. We can actually put this in its own frame, Shift-P, just to make that clear. So these are their own grids. If I look at them, they're identical. Whoops, no difference here. But what I'm going to do is for this grid, the bottom one, I'm just going to offset it by 1. Why 1? Not why 1, like why the number 1? Because if we're doing mod 2, half of that is 1, which means we're going to be half a cycle off. If this was 3, I'd do 1.5, etc. So now you can see this one's doing this, but the other one's kind of like offset. I guess it's a little hard to tell, so I'm just going to mix them together. So this is kind of almost the transition. So I'm kind of showing one or the other, but I'm going to do 50% so you can see both. You can see when one flickers out, the other one's still like making progress. Is that, does that like make sense, or is that like hard to tell? I don't know. I feel like the way I've done it is a little hard to tell. Either way, the way you want to imagine this is one is like offset by half a transition. So as one flickers out, we already have one to like substitute it with. And then the question is, when do we have it set to one, and when do we have it set to another, and where does the transition happen, and all that? Good question. Well, let's actually take some notes down. And I mean that literally. We're going to use the annotation tool. So I'm going to make a line here. And then this is something only tutorial makers need to know. When you do an annotation, you want to lock it so that it stays on every frame. Okay, so I have a timeline. I know there's a timeline here, but I'm drawing my own. I don't care. Here's what we're going to notice. As this increases, so this is kind of like our time, which is its own expression. As this increases and we go to 1, that's where we get our first flickering, where one grid goes back to the beginning and the other one doesn't. You know what? It probably makes sense to divide this by a bigger number, 45, just so it goes a bit slower. But the point still holds. So as this gets to 1, our first grid goes back. As you can see, there's a flickering. So I'm just going to mark that. So we have 0. When's time, not time, but when like this time expression is equal to 0. We have 0, 1, 2, 3. Can you guess what's next? That's right. 5. No, it's 4. Okay, we have our timeline. And as we go to 1, we need our first transition to happen. In fact, it should happen like right here, a bit before. Which way should we transition? In other words, should this be set to 1 or 0 or whatever? Well, as we get a bit before 1, let's experiment. If we go to 1, the grid's a bit small. If we go to 0, we get back our larger grid. Hopefully this is understandable. So what I'm saying is right before we get to the number 1, this should be set to 0 if we want to be on time. Okay? So you can almost imagine, and I know I'm going very slowly. We'll move faster in a second. So as we're transitioning into this popping, we want to make sure that we're already set to 0 so that we're ready, because this one's not popping. It's still scaling down. On the other hand, when we get to the next integer, and again, we're going mod 2, so it matters. When we get to the next integer, which is 2, let's see what happens. The other one pops, but the other one's now ready because they're exactly half a phase offset from each other. And right before we get to 2, let's see, if we set this all the way to the other side, then we'd be good. So we want it to go this way. And if you experiment with this, you're going to find out that it oscillates because it's mod 2. In other words, right before we get to the number 1, 3, 5, all the odd positive integers, we want to make sure that our factor is set to 0. When we're at the even integers, right before then, it should be set to 1. And we kind of need to find a way to animate this transition every single time. So how do we do that? Here is how we do that. So let's start off with these odd numbers, 1, 3, 5, etc. Well, what we want to do is as it gets close, and I'm going to use a map range to do this, as our time function gets close to 1, let's say, let's give it a bit of buffer room, so between 0.8 and 1, so for the 0.2 before then, so right before 1, from maybe 0.7, let's say, we want this to transition from 1 to 0, because it's going left. We want our factor to be 0. So we're going to go from 1 to 0. Interesting. So as our time is getting close to 1, we're going to give it 0.3 buffer room. We're going to go from 1 to 0. Okay? Easy enough. This will work for the 1 integer, but it's not going to work for 3, 5, etc., because we need it to be, 2.7 to 3 and 4.7 to 5. We need this to repeat just like these grids are repeating. So I'm just going to take one of these like mod 2s and just kind of throw it in here. So modulo 2. And now this should be repeating. So let's test this. Let's see what this actually gives us. So if we use this as the factor, we're going to have the grid and then transition, and it works. So the first transition, this smooth transition that works fine, is as we cross 1, as you can see, works. But now when we get to 2, we should expect to see some popping, right? Because we haven't addressed that yet, so pop. But now, as we get close to 3, that one's a transition. So we've taken care of all the odd ones. The even ones, not so much. Well, how do we do the even ones? Sherlock? Like Sherlock, tell me. Well, we need to do the same thing, but just kind of offset it a bit. In the same way that these groups are the same, except we offsetted it by 1, we're going to do the same here. So it's still going to be mod 2, but we're going to add 1. So really, it's kind of like the same thing going on here. This one, you have to kind of go through a bit of a mental exercise here. Because we've offset it by 1, this 0.7 to 1 still works. You might think, oh, you should do 1.7 to 2 because it's right before 2, but we've offset it by 1. The only difference is instead of going from 1 to 0, notice our arrow is going the other way. We want the factor to be equal to 1 in this mix node. We want to go from 0 to 1. So let's see what this looks like. So originally we had our odd number transition. Let's see our even number transition. So we should expect the first transition as we cross across this 1 integer. That should not work at this point. So let's see. And we cross 1, there's a pop, so it didn't work. But now let's see an even number, so we're about to cross 2, and we had that nice transition. 3, pop, 4, nice transition. In other words, we've separated this into 2 camps. Left-handed and right-handed people. Left-handed wins. Did you know Obama's left-handed? If you've ever met a left-handed person, there's a good chance they know that fact about them, because you kind of have pride in being left-handed. It doesn't make any sense. It's like, I can't think of anything that matters less, especially in this age where we're typing everything. And to be honest, I think only like 10% of people are left-handed. So is it something to be ashamed of or prideful of? I'm left-handed, as it turns out. What the fuck were we talking about? So these will work for the odd numbers. These will work for the evens. So let's actually frame these up just like we did the others. Whoa, big frame. I just want these. What we need to do is we need to transition these transitions. So we have odd transitions and even. You know what? I'm going to do? And you're welcome for this. I'm just going to type it out. Odd, even. We need to transition these transitions for the transition. How are we going to do that? Well, same thing as we did before. So we're going to mix these now. So we're going to mix before we get the factor for the grid mix, right? And we somehow need to say sometimes use the odd, sometimes use the even, and use that as the factor. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, without thinking about it too much, we know that it's going to swap every integer or so, right? We know from experience that's going to be a mod 2 situation. So we can just kind of go brain dead and be like, yes, this is going to be a thing. So we have our time function going into mod 2. This isn't exactly going to work because we want this to be on or off. This right now is just rounding, every time it goes past 2, so it's going to have a weird look to it. In fact, let me just show you. So now we have a transition for the transitions. Here's what it's going to look like. So it worked sometimes, and then some other times it's weird. It's not what we want. It turns out, if you think about it, the odd transitions are good until we get past 1, and then we want to swap to the evens, and then we get past 2, and then we want to swap to the odds. To do that, I think it should be mod 2, but then when do we know we get past 1? We do that by rounding. It's either up or down. Fuck if I know. I think it's down. We'll see if that works. Let's see. Transition. Nope. Okay, I figured it out. It didn't take that long, but it was, I kind of wish I did it live. But let me tell you, when you're doing a tutorial, it is hard to think in math unless you've practiced quite a bit. So the solution ended up being a less than node. Let's talk about why. So when you think about it, in the beginning, we want to have the odd transitions. As we cross, 1, it's going to be odd, and then we need to switch. So let's see. If this is going to be odd, we need it to, work for 1. Well, we take mod 2 and we say, when is it less than 1? It's going to keep that for this whole transition. In other words, I feel like I'm just saying nonsense. Let me try to explain that one more time. In other words, as we go between 0 and 1, as we're in here, we want to make sure we're in odds. Well, in other words, are we less than 1? Right? Are we less than 1? Yes. So that's going to work. But the moment we cross past 1 and we want it to flip to the even direction, this less than is no longer true. So now it's swapped. So we've got this one covered, this one, so we got this one covered, and then as we go to 3 and 4, all of those should work because, again, this is going to be mod 2. So it's we do all the work here and then it propagates. Either way, if you don't want to think about it too much, just throw a less than 1 node and make sure these are in the correct order. And you can see transition, that was an odd transition, now an even transition, now an odd transition, and it works. And it will work infinitely. And it's not that messy. In fact, this is cleaner than my original network. Okay? So we've done all this work. Now we just kind of have to add controls and make it look good. But the logic is there. So let's add a bit of control. First thing I want to do is be able to control how much it zooms out, before this transitions. And remember, we have this power thing, and I can actually have these be different powers. So I can have one grid go faster than another. So you can see we have a grid here, but then this one goes way faster. It turns out, who would have thought, it looks good when you pick the same number for both of these. So I'm just going to use the same power and dividing, scaling thing. So originally we had 2. So I'm just kind of outsourcing this to a single parameter. If I set this to 4, it's still going to work, but now it's going to be much faster. Let me make it more insane. 10. Zoom out. So this is if you're really zooming out super quickly. So there is a use for this, as you can imagine. If you want to be fancy, you want to use the letter E. This is the exponential whose derivative is equal to itself. I don't know if that's relevant here, but it is a fact. Don't worry about it too much. I think you do an integer, it will look better though. As you can see, it's each grid has a 3x3 in it, and if we do 4, does it have a 4x4 in it? I don't know. Either way, 3 looks good, so I'm going to stick with 3. That's one parameter. Another parameter we want to have control over is, remember, we have a time expression that's literally hash frame divided by something. Instead of having that all in here, let's be able to control that. So I'm going to do hash frame inside a math node divided by some number, whether it be 30 or 45, whatever. So here, now we have, this is different from the exponential parameter. This is literally the speed of the animation. So if I go 10, it's going to be super fast, but it's still going to be the same magnification, if you want to think about it that way. So now we have 2 parameters. We have this one. We have this one. Technically, we could add a parameter for the thickness of these lines, but I don't care. We could also add a parameter for the transition. I'm not going to do that here, but if you want to think about it, if I invite you to think about it, if we use 0.5 instead of 0.7, there will be a longer transition. So this will be much smoother. So that's how I got that. I'm just going to go back to 0.7. So you can turn that into its own parameter. And you could do a bunch of other stuff. But for now, I'm going to keep these 2 parameters, and let's try to make this thing look good. So we want it to glow, and we want to not see any black. Well, at this point, we basically have a factor mask, right? It's just a black and white image. Let's use that for a mix shader. So we're going to, we are going to mix shader, and that's going to be our factor. And what do we want to mix? Well, wherever this is white, we want it to glow. So we're going to put that in the bottom socket because that's how Blender works for some reason. So that's going to glow, and we can make that brighter. And we probably want to enable bloom. Yeah, buddy. So it's glowing, and we can change the color. And then for the rest of it, we shouldn't be able to see it. So that's going to be a transparent BSDF. And because we're in Eevee, and I remember the first time I did this, I'm like, oh, I just don't know how Blender works. But it turns out, Eevee, you just got to turn on Alpha Blend or Hashed or one of these. Alpha Blend seems to work. And this is going to give us transparency everywhere that there isn't that. And it already looks good. But we can change the color, There's more stuff to add. First of all, the fade. We don't want to see like the boundaries of this plane that it's projected on. By the way, if you were to change this to be dependent on UV coordinates instead of object coordinates, you can do some weird stuff, although kind of seems to be working here. Either way, you could probably put this on a cylinder or something, or a sphere. That'd be something. Either way, off topic, let's do the fade. For the fade, let's keep it simple. I don't want to talk about it too much. We're just going to make kind of like a faded off square. To do this, simple trick. We're going to use object coordinates since they're centered, and that's easy to think about. We're going to take that. We're going to separate it by x, y, z. I'm going to take the x coordinate, absolute value y, so that it's mirrored. All the negative values are now positive. It's mirrored on the x-axis. I'm going to do the... I don't want that. I'm going to do the same for the y-axis. And then just like we kind of combined the wave textures, it really is full circle. Just like we combined the wave textures, we're going to maximum these two together. So it's the same idea, just on a 1 unit scale. And then maybe not greater than. We want the gradient. I'm going to subtract. And that's going to give us control over this gradient. Either way, we want to multiply it by this so that... as it's towards the center, it gets brighter, and then, etc. You could also use a radial gradient for this if you want it to be a circular fall off instead. But that's not the reality we're living in. So let's just accept what we got. We're going to multiply these two ideas together. So we have the whole grid. You just multiply it by this, so we'll make it kind of fade off. And let's see what that looks like. Now you can see a bit of a fade. Maybe we should clamp this to not get anything weird. It looks a bit better. I'm thinking it should be a bit of a softer fall off. Fast way to do that, map range, set this to smoother step. And here's before, and here's after, and it just looks better. And we can change the subtraction to, do the thing, or you can change kind of the fall off of this grid. Also, one more tip, since we also use map range for these transitions, there's no reason you can't smoother step the transition, so it's going to actually blend in a smooth way, if you think about it that way. Either way, we said either way 1,000 times. Either way, we have the fade. And I think the final thing... Oh, I have so much mucus in my nose. I'm going for it. Oh, when you have like hard calcified mucus and it's coming down the back of your throat and you can't breathe normally until you kind of pull it out? That's what just happened. Okay, that was gross. Either way, final thing. I'm going to turn off the light. The environment light, that is. Final thing is, we have the parameters. Let's just give this thing a color that isn't just a single color, but based on a gradient or something like that. Again, fast way of doing this, gradient texture. I'm going to use spherical, so it looks like a sphere, but we want it centered, so make sure you're using object coordinates, because those are the centered ones. If you learned anything from this tutorial, it's that. Hope you learned more than that. I'm going to use that as the emission. I'm going to color ramp it so we have a gradient of colors. The center can be blue, and the outskirts, as we're going, it's a radial thing. The outskirts can be red, and maybe the center can be a different color so it doesn't fade to white. Look at that. Beautiful. Make it glow a bit more than that. Actually, maybe a better way to increase the bloom is bring down the threshold. Yeah, there we go. And bump it up a bit. By the way, if you're seeing this weird circle here, that's just a viewport artifact. The moment you pause it, it's gone. So there you go. We did the thing. It looks good. Does it not? I mean, this is basically it. The rest of it is just kind of tweaking settings until you get the exact look you want. But the important parameters, like how much does it divide until it does the thing, we have that, and the speed of it, so we can have it go much faster and all of that. But yeah, I mean, that's the basic grid thing. And now let me just like set up a project and do a concierge render sponsor plug. So I used the procedural grid we made to make a tiny little scaling animation with a moon and a monkey and a torus knot. And it doesn't make sense, but that's fine. Either way, we have this scene and we want to render it in a way that isn't, intensive for our computer, especially if it's like a big scene or it's very long or whatever. In cases like this, we usually outsource our render to a render farm. And in this case, there we go. We are going to be rendering this using Concierge Render. If you haven't heard of it, it's a render farm for Blender, and you can render out your projects for fairly cheap. So once you have your blend finished, whether it be this or something else, we just got to prep it and get it over to Concierge Render. To do that, a couple things. First of all, go to File, clean up, and just get rid of any unused data blocks if you have any. In my case, it seems like I have none, but I do have a recursive one. Second of all, so this just makes your blend file smaller. You're not bringing stuff you don't need. Second of all, go to File, External Data, and if you haven't already, make sure you click Automatically Pack into Blend, and this is going to make sure that any assets like image textures, in this case I have an HDRI and a moon texture, because I needed a texture for this moon, it's going to make sure that they're all packed. And once you've done that, just make sure you like your render settings, although we can change those later. Save it out, and I'll see you over at Concierge Render. Okay, so we're at the website, conciergerender.com. If you haven't made an account, make one. And you're going to get $5 in free render credits, which is actually quite a bit. Depending on the scenes you have, it could actually be a couple scenes if they're not huge. So make an account, and let's log in. Okay, so I'm logged into my Concierge Render account. How do we get this thing working? Well, it's pretty simple. First of all, we got to upload our project, and then we just got to hit render. So go to upload and launch renders, go to upload your file, just find wherever you saved your blend or zip file, depending on what you have. In my case, I think I just called it scalingexample.blend. It's going to upload with all the textures and everything, assuming you actually did the steps that I talked about. And you can see that it is right there, alphabetical order. So once it's here, actions, launch render. It's going to think about it for a moment, and then we're just going to pick render settings and have Concierge render it for us. So pretty much we're just going to pick what makes sense. So let's see, render platform, we're using Blender 2.93. So pick, I don't even know what this one is, to be honest. Pretty interesting. But either way, 2.93, render engine cycles. A lot of this it's just going to port over from the blend file, which is pretty nice. We want to render an animation. I think it was like 90 frames. Next, it's going to take our frame count, so automatically knows it was 105 frames. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Knows our resolution. Samples I'm actually going to change, make it a bit higher, so it's a bit higher quality. Hardware, this is actually what matters the most. Basically, here's where you choose. Do you want the fastest hardware that's going to cost a bit more but render faster down here, or the slower hardware that, depending on your computer, this might even be faster than what you have, but you want to pick your hardware to cost thing. Either way, I'm just going to pick the standard one, and just click render. It's going to make that a render job. Go to the job manager, go here, and you're going to see the progress bar, and you're going to see how long it takes to render, how much it costs, etc. So let's skip till it's done. 105 frames completed. Very exciting. But here you can see all the information. So you can see it costs 38 cents, a little under, a lot under $50. It kind of depends on your perspective of money. Under $50 to render 105 frames. Here's how long it took. And you can see we can download each of these as PNGs since that's what was picked. So here's the first frame. Indeed, that's what it's supposed to look like. And then let's go a bit further. There should be a monkey. Let's see if that's the case. Yes, we have the monkey and the torus knot. So download the images, not one by one. But go to download outputs, and it's going to zip them up, and you can download them like that. But there you go, Concierge Render. I would recommend a render farm if you want to render faster, or if you have bad hardware, or, a mix of the two. So Concierge Render, thanks for sponsoring.